Ladies and gentlemen, hello again, and welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name's Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the Zlín Z-142. It's a freeware model, and I've been having a lot of fun with it over the past few weeks. It's really nicely detailed and lots of fun to fly. I thought today we'd take it on a short flight from Žilina over to Pannon in Slovakia. Flight times are around about 15 or 20 minutes, but on the way we'll have a look at the elevator trim system and see if we can dispel some myths about the purpose of the elevator trim and how it's to be used to control or to assist control of the aircraft. As I said, the model itself is very nicely detailed. You've got some static features on the ground. You can take the battery in and out, you can open and close the engine cowling, and it's very well done for a freeware model. Let's close the canopy. We can open the blinds on the overhead panel. And it's got the iPad AviTab plug-in here as well. So we're going to fly from Žilina, take off on runway 06, across the valleys here and down to Pannon. It's a very short flight. I'm going to turn the iPad off because it can kind of get in the way up there on the instrument panel. We can choose GNS 430 if we want. We can make it metric or imperial. I have mine set to imperial because we've got the imperial instruments on the left hand side, although you've always got metric available on the right hand side as well. I don't mind flying with kilometers per hour, that's fine. This is miles per hour on the outside, but I do really need an altimeter in feet. My brain doesn't work in meters for the height. Other than that, it's very straightforward. Interestingly, it's a 6-cylinder inline engine, and it's also got a supercharger. It produces 210 horsepower at takeoff power. Let's set the aircraft up. It's dead straightforward. We're going to flick the master switch on. We're going to come down to the switch panel here. I've changed the labels over so that I've got English labels on this cockpit. The accumulator, that's basically the battery. The generator, the starter. I'll leave the radio off during engine start. We'll put on the flight instruments, and I'm also going to put on the rotating beacon and set the fuel tanks to the right tank. After that, we'll make sure the supercharger here is selected. That needs to be fully forward to engage because the starter motor drives the engine through the supercharger gear. I'll open the throttle slightly, make sure the parking brake's set, and we'll prime the engine a few times. You can see the fuel pressure there. I'll set the mags to 1 and 2. So we've got throttle, we've got mixture, supercharger, mags. Propeller's clear, full aft stick, and start. We've got 1000 RPM and the oil pressure is in the green. Excellent. So we need to allow the aircraft to warm up a little bit. We've got the oil temperature on the top here. I'm not going to go above 1000 RPM until that's at least in the yellow, and then we go up to 1500 RPM to warm up the cylinder head temperatures. Now, I believe it's using X-Plane stock engine modelling, so it can be quite slow to warm up to temperature, and my experience is the oil pressure is a little bit on the high side, but we don't really need to worry about that too much. With the engine running, I shall switch on the radio switch here, and that brings all the electronics to life. And we also need to align the gyros on this aircraft. So firstly, I've got to turn the transformer on here. It's electric horizon. I'll uncage it. The flag goes away and my horizon is able to be used. I need to align the directional gyro as well. So the aircraft is roughly pointing north. If I pull this knob here and then rotate it until it's pointing north. So unlike Western instruments or more traditional flight instruments, it's a needle in the middle that changes. North is always at the top. Push that back in again and my directional gyro is oriented north, and the reference pointer here I'm going to put onto 060 just for the runway. So that oil temperature is coming up. It's in the yellow just now. I need to make sure all the fuel tank selections work as well. I've got 4 fuel tanks on the aircraft, the 2 outers and the 2 inners. You can see we've got fillers for inner and outer. It's fuel injected. Any fuel that is put into the fuel system, taken from the tanks and sent to the engine, but then isn't used by the engine, is returned to the fuel tanks. And in this aircraft, it's always returned to the right tank. So we always start on the right tank, because if I was on the left tank and the right tank was full, the return fuel would simply pour out the vents. So always a good idea to start on the right. I'll move over to left and right for the time being to verify we still have feed. And with the oil temperature coming up, I'm just going to increase the RPM a little bit. No more than 1500 to help the engine warm up. So it's fairly straightforward aircraft to operate. The only unusual things about it are the artificial horizon is in the reverse sense. You've got the sky at the bottom and the ground at the top. That takes a lot of getting used to. And also the mixture control here is a 4-position selector. For all practical purposes, keeping it straight up and down is what matters. The supercharger here is the one that will catch you out. So I said we're going to talk about the trim on the aircraft. While it's warming up, let's take a look outside. And if I move the view carefully, which is always a challenge in X-Plane, we can have a look at the elevator on the aircraft. So if I gently move the elevator, we've got 3 pieces of elevator we're interested in. This is the elevator surface itself. I've got the horn of the aerodynamic balance here. I've got the trim tab and the balance tab on the other side. So firstly, the horn. This is an aerodynamic balance. Okay, imagine airflow coming from the front. It's going to want to return this to the level position. So to reduce the flight control loads, we've got a balance here. That means that any airflow here is going to try and increase the elevator deflection, not reduce it, and it provides a nice aerodynamic feel to the controls. There's also usually an element of, let me just move the view around carefully, there's an element of mass in here as well. That's to help prevent flutter on the control surface. By moving the centre of gravity of the control further forward, it reduces flutter. It can also stall. You can stall the tailplane just as you install the main plane, and the horn area is more prone to stalling than this side, than the inboard element. And because this part of the elevator is slightly more effective, you can put a bending load on the elevator as well. So you don't want too much of a horn area on the elevator. You can even have overbalance, at which point the elevator would reach a certain deflection and the aerodynamic loads would snap it to full deflection. We want to try and avoid that. There's also a balance tab on the back. You can see the far side here. It's doing roughly the same job. It's trying to reduce the control loads for us. It's essentially flying the elevator surface. On the near side, we've got the trim tab. If I trim the aircraft nose down, you can see that trim tab is coming up. Now that seems counterintuitive. Why is the trim tab coming up when I'm trimming nose down? Well, imagine this little trim tab here is going to fly the elevator. That's going to push down on the trailing edge of the elevator, which is going to cause a nose down moment. So the trim tab appears to always work in reverse compared to the elevator surface itself. That's completely normal, and you can see that with the rudder as well. The rudder tab operates in the opposite direction. The rudder also has the horn balance at the top here. That's to manage the aerodynamic loads. So it's warming up quite nicely. We're into the yellow just now. I'm going to check the left tank operates, and with that we can probably taxi out. So I'll reduce the power, I'll put the taxi light on, release the brakes, and off we go. Quick check on the brakes, making sure the artificial horizon stays level, and checking that the directional gyro remains aligned. That's 330 and 330. All looks to be good. If you fly out of Žilina in X-Plane, be very careful of this fuel truck down here. It basically tears around the airport and appears out of nowhere if you park in the other general aviation parking area. There he goes. So I'm going to have to enter and backtrack on runway 06. I want to do the power checks as well, so this seems like a good place to do the power checks. I'll come to a halt, set the parking brake, turn the taxi light back off again. Excellent, so to do the power checks, it's reasonably straightforward. I'm going to do the power checks on the right hand tank, because that's the tank I'm going to use for takeoff. And according to the manual, we'd have to wait until the cylinder head temps were in the green before we do the power checks. However, it does seem to struggle to get there. It takes a long time to get there. I've been using 100 degrees and making sure the oil is in the green, and after that I'm fairly happy. So what we need to do is to check the mags first of all. I'll come up to 1700 RPM. And we'll use the mag switch. I'll isolate one of the mags. We get a slight drop. Back to both. I'll isolate the other mag. Similar slight drop. Back to both. So a little bit of a drop and no big difference between the mags. The mags are good. Check the engine instruments. Check the electrical systems here. All is well. It's got a variable pitch prop as well, a constant speed prop. So I'm going to come up to 2000 RPM. I'm going to check the prop, make sure we get that RPM drop, go back to full fine, and I'll repeat it one more time, just to make sure that any cold oil in the propeller governor is replaced with warm oil from the engine. I'll come back to idle smoothly, and then back to 1000 RPM. And with that, the power check is complete, the aircraft's ready to go. All we need to do is the before takeoff elements. The runway entrance is just here, so we'll do everything here. Firstly, hatches and harnesses, or doors and seatbelts, that's done. Flight instruments, set and checked, aligned. Engine instruments are all checked and in the green. Throttle friction is not a thing in the simulator. The trim, set the trim to roughly the takeoff position. Mixture is vertical, mags are on both, prop is fully fine, primer is locked. Fuel, set to the correct tank, no fuel pump. Flaps are to the takeoff position. No carb heat to worry about, it's fuel injected and the flight control check. So go all the way around and make sure we get full and free movement. We did the rudder on the taxi out. So the before takeoff checklist is complete, dead straightforward. All we need to do as we line up is put the pitot heating on and put the rest of the lights on. We're able to line up. So talking about the takeoff in this aircraft, it's got a supercharged engine. You can see down at the bottom of the instrument panel here. This is the boost gauge, or the manifold pressure gauge. 1.0 is basically the atmospheric pressure at sea level. If we go beyond that, we're into the boost. The supercharger is providing boost. It's quite limited in this aircraft. We've got 5 minutes at takeoff power, but on the demonstration videos that the developer released, they demonstrate coming back to 1.0, i.e. off boost, as soon as possible during the takeoff. So based on my miles per hour speeds here, we're going to rotate at roughly 60 miles per hour and target 87 miles per hour or 140 knots in the climb. Once we're climbing positively, I'll retract the flaps, then I'll bring the power back from roughly 1.18, which is the takeoff limit, back to 1, and then I'll nudge the prop RPM down to 2500. I've got key bindings for the propeller control. If you're flying this model, make sure you read the documentation that comes with it. The developers recommend an element of stability augmentation that I don't usually fly with. I was a bit skeptical to begin with, but it does make the aircraft a lot more enjoyable. So I've been flying with that turned on with this model. Right, ready to go. Lined up on 06, gyros ahead, let's go. So coming up to about 1.18, it's possible to overboost the engine, so that looks good enough. 50 miles an hour, 16, rotate. I'll accelerate in a gentle climb. There's 80 miles an hour. I'll pitch up, bring the flaps up, and I'll bring the power gradually back to 1.0. Now I'm back at 1.0, I'll just bring the RPM back ever so slightly to 2500. And I'll adjust the trim. We'll climb out at 85, 87 miles per hour, or just around about 140 kilometers. So this aircraft is an aerobatic trainer, but it has to be at very light weights for aerobatics. You only use the left tank, I believe. See the markings on the left tank there for the aerobatic range. And it's very responsive to the controls. However, for an aircraft with 210 horsepower at takeoff, 500 feet a minute at 85 knots, 85 miles an hour is not really that impressive. It's got very short little wings here, and an airfoil that's clearly built for performance, for aerobatic performance rather than cruise performance, climb performance. I think it's fantastic. I've had a lot of fun with it. So in the climb out, fuel pressure's fine, oil temperature's fine. You can see the oil pressure is a little bit on the high side. That just seems to be a function of the X-plane engine modelling. Nothing to worry about, I think. And what we'll do is we'll climb up to 2,500 feet, and then we'll explore how the trim works. Very scenic part of the world. I love exploring in X-plane. I love going places that I've not been in real life, and I love the variety of aircraft we have available. This is an aircraft that it just appeals to me because it's quite unique. It's quite quirky compared to your American aircraft. So when the aircraft is trimmed, the trim is actually setting a speed the aircraft will maintain by itself. Because it's called the elevator and because the trim is related to the pitch control, people believe trim controls up and down. In actual fact, the trim controls the speed. And as I said in one of the previous videos, you can think about that for gliders, because gliders have got an elevator and they've got a trim control. A glider's got no control over its up and down capability, that's all environmental, but it does have control over its airspeed. So we're going to fly along this river here and through this valley. We'll get it leveled off at 2,500 feet and then we'll have a look at the trim. So to level the aircraft, I'm going to lower the nose with the elevator. I'm going to bring the power back to around about 0.85, and then I'm going to adjust the RPM to 2350, just about that white splodge on the instrument there. I'm also going to hold that pitch attitude and then adjust the trim ever so slowly to take the pressure off the stick. Now that we're level here, I can also deselect the supercharger. So it's 0.85 at the moment, supercharger comes out, and then I'll reset 0.85 by increasing the power. You can use the supercharger in the climb, but you don't need it for straight and level flight at lower levels. So just give it a minute or so to make sure the aircraft is settled out and make sure it's trimmed out. I'll come down here, I'll make sure the lights are selected off now. We'll leave the beacon and the strobes on. and the right tank is down a little bit, so I'll go to left and right on the fuel tanks. Don't spend too long heads down, otherwise it'll get away from you. So here we are. We're basically trimmed out. If I adjust the view so you can roughly see the stick, we are in straight and level flight at 105 miles per hour. Now I'm not going to touch my elevator control if I can possibly avoid it. I'll keep the aircraft straight and level, keep the aircraft wings level with the ailerons, but I'll not make any real pitch input on the joystick. What I'll do is I'll increase the power from 0.85 up to 0.95. Bearing in mind we're doing 105 miles an hour, there's the power increasing. You see the nose of the aircraft comes up and it starts to climb. Now I haven't pulled the nose up with the elevator, that's a function of increasing the power. As I said, the elevator trim sets the speed of the aircraft. Now you'll note in the climb it won't stabilise at 105 miles an hour, it will stabilise ever so slightly slower than 105. That's simply because the elevator trim is in the propeller wash. So it's not getting a pure airspeed over the elevator, it's getting the propeller accelerating the air of the elevator. Higher power setting, it has more effect and makes the trim slightly more effective. But roughly speaking, you can see that we are climbing at basically the same speed we were before. And as I increase the power, you see that my rate of climb increases. It's dead straightforward. If you're struggling with approach speed in a flight simulator, the chances are you're not trimming the aircraft correctly, because once it's trimmed, if you get any pitch up or pitch down that you're correcting on the stick, then that tells you that you're not flying at the speed you're trimmed for. So to level at 3,000 feet, rather than adjusting the stick, let me move the view down again, rather than adjusting the stick, I'll just bring the power back to 0.85. And you'll see the aircraft oscillate a couple of times, and then it should maintain roughly 105 knots and roughly level flight. Now nothing's perfect in the world. X-plane with the weather turned off really gives us a very stable environment. In the real world, you couldn't trim an aircraft to fly hands off for more than a couple of minutes in anything other than perfectly still conditions. But before you start fighting the aircraft on the trim, remember that you're trimming for an airspeed, not for a rate of climb. So if the aircraft's flying at the correct speed, and it's climbing because of the environmental conditions, then probably a power reduction would be appropriate. The two controls go hand in hand. Pitch and power are interrelated to each other. We'll climb up a little bit further, so I'll increase the power again. Now bearing in mind in this aircraft, to do a proper climb I'd come back to 140 kilometers or 87 miles an hour. But this is simply to demonstrate the fact that I'm not making any change to the trim, I'm not making any change to elevator control, I'm simply climbing the aircraft by adding power. It's really stunning scenery around here with the ortho scenery. I tend to fly in more, my general aviation flying is more in the flatlands, so having the hills around here is quite unique and enjoyable. So I'll stop the climb at 3,500 feet. The airfield we're going to is Martin, just over here. And all of that climbing is simply done by applying power on the aircraft. Approaching the target altitude, I'll just reduce the power ever so slightly, and the aircraft will return roughly to straight and level flight. Now these little oscillations the aircraft's doing, we can fix that with the pitch control. You wouldn't obviously sit here and let it oscillate unnecessarily, simply a demonstration. So given the airfield's ahead, I'm going to put the landing lights and the tax light back on again. I'm going to check my power and I'll put the supercharger back in. We need the supercharger in the event of a missed approach. So Martin is 1,400 feet above sea level. So we'll fly down to 2,400 feet for the pattern, and it's a north-south runway. So I'm going to change my little pointer here. Remember, this is just a pointer, it's not the gyro. The gyro is still aligned correctly. I'll point it north-south. We'll fly downwind right-hand to land runway 36. Fuel tanks are still in balance, correctly balanced. So final demonstration of the trim to descend, rather than adjusting anything else, I'm just going to bring the power off gradually. You see the speed washes off, the aircraft responds by lowering the nose, and down it goes. It should establish at the airspeed of about 105 miles an hour, plus a little bit because of the prop effects as I mentioned. So from the moment we got to the initial level flight out of Žilina, I haven't adjusted the pitch trim. We've just made all the changes on the power. It's a good exercise to make sure that you are aware of how the pitch trim operates. It's a good way to demonstrate it. Obviously, for practical applications, pitch and power work together. You can see the airfield yet? There it's here, we've got two grass runways. We're going to fly south of this town here, across, and then in from the south. Some of the scenery out to the east here is even more spectacular. Well worth downloading some ortho photos and going flying around here. Very pretty. So it looks like a good spot to enter the downwind. You can see having the iPad mounted up here can be a bit obstructive. So when I get down to my pattern altitude of 2,400 feet, I'm going to make a slight power increase, but only up to 0.8, so I will need to retrim for a slightly slower flight. There you go. Power's coming up, and I'll adjust the pitch with the elevator now. Start adjusting the trim. One of the little gotchas in this aircraft is you've got to be aware that you're flying towards here and not towards here. Having the nose shape, it's quite compelling to end up slightly left of where you want to be. So just basically look up from these instruments here, you're going there. So we're at the platform altitude, back at around about 100 miles an hour, 160 kilometers on the downwind leg. Downwind checks, there's no fuel pumps, the instruments are aligned and there's sufficient fuel for all the flying we've got to plan. So two runways, we're going to land on the leftmost runway. The airfoil, the shape on this aircraft, the wing shape is has a very pronounced on-off kind of characteristic. There's a point it just stops flying. So the approach speed is slightly faster. The approach speed is the same as the initial climb speed, 87 miles an hour, about 75 knots. We're going to do the landing in 3 phases. We're going to arrest the rate of descent with the elevator. Once we're flying level, we'll bring the power off, and then the third phase will continue to pitch up to make sure we touch down on the main gear. You can do it all together, but initially with this aircraft you'll find that it bleeds energy a lot quicker than perhaps you're expecting. So towards the end of the downwind leg, I don't want to fly over this village. It gives us a good marker if we fly around the end here. And we'll use both stages of flap for the landing. There we go, we'll turn in. It likes quite a steep approach as well, this aircraft, so normally in a slightly slippier aircraft I'd start to descend on the base leg. I'll keep the aircraft at the traffic pattern altitude. A steeper approach works better in this aircraft. It doesn't like being dragged in on a 3-degree slope. To be fair, not many singles do. But there's base leg, inside the white arc, so I'll select the first stage of flaps. I'll select the second stage of flaps, and then we'll trim. So I'm looking for 85 to 87 miles per hour. Now I need to move the propeller lever forward. I had 2300 RPM set, it's back at 2000 because the propeller's already as fine as it can go. So I'll move the propeller forward now. The brakes are off, the undercarriage is fixed. The mixture is full rich with the supercharger in and the prop is fully fine. The landing checklist is complete. Adjusting the power, I'm aiming right for the threshold of the runway. It's not the longest, it's about 1,100 metres. Plenty long enough for general aviation though. There's 85 miles an hour. And as you can see, it's a little bit steeper approach than you'd be used to on other aircraft types. Watching the centre line with the visual picture here. Looking at the far end of the runway. Never look at the aiming point now, always the far end. Here's stage 1, adjusting the pitch for level flight. Stage 2, power coming off. Stage 3, increasing the pitch just until we touch down. I'll hold the nose up. Lower it down nicely. And I'll come to full aft stick just to take the pressure off the nose gear. I'll let it roll to a halt. Or roll to a suitable turning speed. And with that, we'll turn around and taxi back to parking. According to the airfield guide, you would taxi down the left-hand side of the runway here, the grass, the side of the runway, but X-Plane makes that unnecessarily sticky, so I'll just taxi down the side of the runway here. Before I put the flaps away, I'll put the pitot heat off, and then I'll put the flaps up. That saves me having to move the head position around. I'll recage the horizon here, and I'll turn the transformer off for the horizon. We'll leave everything else until we get off the runway. Oh, actually, we've got the supercharger as well. Let me get rid of that. There we go. So you can see on the landing how quickly the aircraft bleeds energy. We probably touched down about 200 metres down the runway. We could have taken another 100 or maybe 50 metres off that by doing everything in one single motion. The round out, the power, keeping the nose coming up. But to learn to land this aircraft initially, I found that a lot easier to break it down into those 3 elements. The round out, where you fly level, then the power, and then increasing the pitch prior to touchdown. We can have a look at it on the replay in just a few seconds. So leaving the active runway, I switch the lights and the strobes off. We'll leave the taxi light on, and we'll park over here. I'll just turn it by 45 degrees, that way empty parking behind us doesn't get the prop wash when we start up. So parking brake is set. I'll reset 1000 RPM. I'll switch the radios off before we shut down. Let me do it with the ADF and there, and radio switch goes off. Before we shut down, quick check on the mags. We want to make sure that we can ground both mags to make sure the propeller is safe. So we get a drop with no stop and drop no stop. So both mags are grounding correctly. What we can't do with this aircraft is turn it off by pulling the mixture to idle cutoff, because we don't have that ability. So we'll come back to idle. We'll switch the mags to off, and as it shuts down, we push the throttle forward. Back to idle. Dead straight forward. We can turn the lights off. We can turn the switches off, and the fuel selector off, and the master off. The walking away checks, we've got throttle, mixture, fuel, mags, and switches. Everything's switched off. That's the Zlín 142. Let's have a look at that landing, see how it looked. Replay mode. I come back, let me just drag it a little bit. Where were we? That looks okay. So, here we go. You see we pitch to fly level, power comes off, and then gradually increase the pitch and touchdown. Reasonable space on the tail, reasonable nose gear off the ground. We don't want to have the nose all the way up in the air. We could have held it off perhaps a little bit longer than that. But if I go back just until the point of touchdown, do it nice and slowly. We pause there and we zoom out. We can see that even aiming for the threshold, it's been a quarter of the runway until we touch down. So for really short field work, you want to move your aiming point a little bit before the threshold, or indeed have a more prompt reduction in the power. That's the Zlín 142. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. And let me know if you want to see any more videos with this little airplane. I really enjoy flying it. If you don't have it in your collection, I'd strongly recommend you go and download it and have some fun with it. Flies really nicely. Just make sure to check the documentation and set your controls up as per the developer's suggestions. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.